Okay, class. This lecture will take us out of the archaic period and towards the classical period, what's called the transitional period, a period from the end of the archaic, end of the 6th century going into the 5th century. And what basically happens is we get away from the stiffening of the natural body, a depiction of the stiffening of the natural body, as we saw like in the Koroi, and sort of very controlled postures, to things that are a lot more natural. And that's with the progression we're seeing in Greek art at this time, is this emphasis, towards making the body look natural and look ideal. That is to say, it doesn't necessarily represent any one person, although frequently they represent deities. But there isn't the realism that we'll get in the Roman periods. This is more to show what an ideal body would look like. And it focuses on young men. Once again, I mentioned in the earlier lectures that the Athenians, at least, were very, there was a very open attitude towards sexuality. And they would engage in bisexual behavior. And so teenage boys, were often considered the objects of beauty. Now, we'll leave that aside for now and talk about this very important statue called the Critias boy. There are a few statues you're ever going to study in art history more important than this one. It's called the Critias boy because we know the name of the sculptor. It was found on the Acropolis, and what's most important here is it breaks away from the stiff frontal postures that we saw before to what's called the contrapposto, which is a stance that's most natural, where weight is shifted onto one leg and the other leg is, relaxed, and the head turned a little bit and one shoulder a little bit lower than the next. We will see this for the rest of the semester, and it'll continue on a lot through art history. People don't stand stiff and frontal unless they're in the military, right? But if you walk around campus and look at people talking to each other, you're going to see that they stand in this contrapposto position. It's just the most relaxed way of standing. And what's interesting about Homo sapiens is that we can stand on two legs and not move. That is to say, we were not only bipedal, but we're bipedal when we're stationary. A lot of animals can be bipedal. Other apes are. But when they come to a standstill, they fall back onto their knuckles. We don't. And this allows us, as I've mentioned before, to use our hands to make things. And it's become a very human thing. And the Greeks were focusing on the human body, and so they show a stance here that's a lot more natural. The struts on his hips are held the rest of his arms, which are now missing. His torso is polished down and molded, that is to say, not engraved, but sanded down in some parts and not in others, to show his musculature. And then his head toward a little bit to the right with a very serious look on his face. The serious look is interesting because we're going to get into what's called the severe style. And that has to do with facial expressions. We'll no longer get the archaic smile that I mentioned in the last class, but now we have them looking very serious, and that will continue on for a while. His eyeballs are empty because there would have been precious gemstones in there. The top of his head is flattened because he would have had a bronze cap with just the hair coming out from underneath. And as we go to the right and turn around, we can see that the buttocks are shifted as well because weight's on a different leg. And so here we see the ideal male form, fit, strong, no scars, handsome, all those sort of things. And this is this will make a big change for us in the transitional period and get us into the high classical. Let's look at some other sculptures. There is the very famous Artemisian Zeus. Artemis is nearby where it was found. Interestingly enough, most of our ancient bronze statues were found underwater because if they weren't from a shipwreck of some sort, they tended to get melted down and reused later on in history. Some people think this might be Poseidon throwing a trident, but the original, scholars thought it was Zeus throwing a lightning bolt. And once again, we see his excellent, a muscular body. Here, his head is turned to the left a bit. He has a long beard to show that he's an adult male. And then his arms outstretched to either side. His right arm holding the thunderbolt or trident, and his left pointing out and guiding it. And then his legs splay apart. The left one has its weight on it, and the right one drags as he's about to get into the throwing action. And here we see just basically a body where the limbs are taken much farther away from the center of the body. Things are splayed out more. Now this one is made out of bronze, so it's a bit easier to do that. You'd pour the bronze into a cast and then put these things together if it's or made in one complete cast potentially. But you see in stone, something like this is much more difficult because it'd be hard to keep, quite frankly, the arms from falling off. So these tend to be preserved for us in metal. But we do know from ancient sources that a lot of these ancient statues that we have in bronze were first made out of marble, and that they were, around. The Romans liked them, the Greeks liked them, etc. But this is all that will be preserved for us. Another interesting thing to pay attention to are just the proportions of the body. And these will become standardized in the 5th century to show what the ideal form of male form is. And then they'll go out of their way to show them more action and more action and more action, and show and the artist will sort of not brag, but show off what abilities they have to show the body in ever greater and more extreme postures. So just keep that in mind as we go through this and much of the rest of the class. Now, a very interesting sculpture that doesn't have that dramatic stance to it, but nevertheless you're probably familiar with, it's very famous, is the Delphi charioteer. So he was, a guy who had a chariot. The bridle is in his right hand. His left arm is missing, but we can see the dowel hole where it went in. Now, he has a very, very strange, long dress on, or robe. This is because there's a couple things here. One of which is, most importantly, is that he would have been behind a chariot. And the only thing that would have shown on the original statue was from about the belt up and his feet. And so this unnaturally long part of the lower part of the body would not have been seen. So that's why these proportions look quite off. Also, by the way, though, in this type of outfit, it got cinched high above the waist as well, but nevertheless is a bit exaggerated. But we can see here this charioteer is showing interest in athletic events, and I'll talk about that more later on. But chariot races were by far the most important of the athletic events that would be held in their Olympics. Once again, I'll talk about that more. But notice once again the seriousness of the face, and also the fact that he is just a charioteer. He's not a god. He's not a statesman. It's just a person, and it's showing their ability to show a variety of stances or people. Unfortunately, we're missing the chariot here, so this sculpture and the horses that it was attached to, although there are fragments of it, it doesn't have as dramatic of a feel, and with this lower part not covered over, it sort of looks odd. In any case, this was a wonderful statue found at Delphi. These are the Riace bronzes. This is one of two. I'm going to show you the second one in a moment. Were found off the coast of Italy and underwater. So once again, well preserved for us. We don't know who or what it presents. That's been a matter of great debate. We won't go into it. But once again, we can see this wonderful posture. His left arm up, he would have been holding a walking stick of some sort, or perhaps a shield. Quite frankly, that's more likely. And on the right, he held a sword. And his hips are, adjusted for the contrapposto, his head looking off to the right. But notice on the far right there his face and the wonderful molding of the beard. And it looks much more natural than we saw before, where things were stylistic, especially when we go back to the archaic period and things were just strings of beads hanging off the head. Now it's a lot better done. And then notice that the lips and the eyes are dealt with separately. What happens there is that they put a bit more copper into the bronze mix, and that makes this red and gives it a nice naturalistic look to it. But here we can see this ideal adult male form that the Greeks so much liked. And here is his partner, once again, most likely standing with a shield in its left hand, arm in its right. He also is missing his helmet, not also in the sense of the last one, but in previous sculptures, and so it's sort of flattened out there. This is the one on the right, by the way. I'm sorry to say. This is the one on the left we just saw. But they're basically pretty much the same types of statues in the same postures, carrying the same weaponry, but really just showing the mastery of the Greek bronze workers. And interestingly enough, once again, these were found off the coast of Italy, the Greeks had colonized Sicily and southern Italy, and they were having great influence on the Italians. Later, we'll talk about the Etruscans and the Romans. And we'll see that happen. And a lot of it occurs because of this. So once again, these bronzes are some of the more spectacular pieces we have, but they are rarer because they're more rarely preserved. Now, one interesting thing here, this is a very famous Tyrannicide, and this is a really interesting sculpture because it shows two men who, a young man and an older man, younger on the right, older on the left, who killed a tyrant. And Athens right now had become a full-blown democracy. The democracy began in the sort of 6th century and got changed and reorganized, etc. But by the 5th century, it was in full. It was completely adopted by Athens and some other cities, and they were very proud of this. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Persian Wars. They're very proud of their democracy. And before they had democracies, they had tyrants and kings, etc. And here, the Tyrannicides are the two people that kill a tyrant. Now, as the story goes, the sister of the guy on the right, the daughter of the guy on the left, was abducted and attacked by the tyrant, and so they took his life. Now, this is very important just for as a myth for the Athenians, and this was set up in the Athenian Agora. This is the shopping area underneath the Acropolis. I touched on it earlier when I talked about the Temple of Theseus in the Agora. And so the Greeks greatly admired this. We have ancient texts that refer to them. And they stand in somewhat symmetrical postures, with the guy on the left with his left leg forward, the guy on the right, his right leg forward, etc. And they both have their arms outstretched, most likely carrying some sort of swords to show that they are about to fight and kill the tyrant and free the people. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is notice the face on the man on the left and the face of the man on the right. And the face of the man is on the right, is in classical archaic style. And it has the beaded hair and the very almondine eyes. Now, the guy on the left, however, is in a full classical style. and his face is shown, not full classical, but getting towards classical, and his face, or his hair on his head, quite frankly, is just shown in a far more realistic manner. It looks like real hair, not stylized hair. And so we see this transition from archaic into classical. What's interesting about the young man on the right, shown in the archaic style, is he's younger, so he should be shown in the later style. But the artist, inverses these for us. And the fact that he's making a reference back to the archaic period, because in the archaic period, statues didn't have this stance for the most part. And so we see this wonderful juxtaposition of these two, and they represent the moments that of the late 6th century and early 5th century where Athens really achieved its democracy. And I'll talk more about history when we get to the Persian Wars. A couple other important pieces are this terracotta statue that was on the top of the temple to Zeus at Olympia. And I'm going to talk about Olympia later on, in probably the next lecture. And here it shows Zeus. He would be on the tip of the pediment, what's called an acroterion. And so this would be the top central statue on this temple to Zeus. Now, I show this to touch on some, just how different the Greeks were as far as sexuality goes and as far as how they considered their gods. Basically, to the Greeks, the only difference between gods, immortals, and humans, mortals, was the fact that they died. Well, we died, rather. The gods didn't die. They were immortal. And they also had powers that we don't have, etc. But in other ways, they behaved just like we do. They had all the sins, they made all the mistakes, etc. Now, the story, it must be shown once again against the backdrop of the idea of the Greek male attitude towards teenage boys. I'll talk about this in greater length later on, but it just was not frowned upon, this type of behavior. And in fact, in Athens, for example, when you wanted to educate your son, you would send him off to study under a man who you admired and trusted, and that man would teach, reading and writing and lecturing and speaking to the son, teach him how to fight in war, but he would also be his lover. And this was just considered very common. Although you don't see it much in the museums, much of the Greek vase paintings has to do with older men and teenage boys. And it just is what it is. And it can't be ignored anymore. When I was a student, as your age, this was barely touched upon. But it's become pretty standard now to teach it. But this story shows Zeus in this running contrapposto stance here, and he has a young man under his arm, and that is Ganymede. Now, Ganymede was the water bearer for the gods, right? The young boy that brought around their water, their glasses of wine. We saw one when we looked at the tomb of the divers before. But Zeus would take him as a lover, and indeed he would abduct him. And that is shown here. And it's shown on the top of this temple to Zeus in the middle of Olympia, which Olympia, as I'll discuss, was basically a city devoted to athletic games. It was a holy city. It wasn't a proper city. It was a place where all the Greeks would come and compete. And so it just shows what different views they had of sexuality and human behavior. But we do see in Zeus's face this transition to classical. It is made out of terracotta, so it's a pretty spectacular piece of work because it's bigger than life size. Not too much bigger, but it is. And so it's a pretty amazing casting. We see the clothing that he wears shows the folds on it, which also highlight the motion. And so I'm going to talk more about that when we get to the Parthenon, the use of folds in the clothing to reveal the body and to show action of some sort. His strong chest is revealed, but the boy Ganymede is naked. Now, also Zeus and Ganymede. This is an old myth. So it was just showing something mythological, but at Olympia. Now back to some sports here. This is what's called the Discobolos by an artist by the name of Myron, Myron. And this is frequently considered one of the great classical, sculptures, making it sort of out of the transition into the full classical period. Because he is shown right at the action where he's about to spin around and release the discus. And his body is turned, and there's a lot of torsion in it and a lot of sort of built up strength. And he's right at the point, he's spun as far around as he can, he's about to release it. Now, this is an interesting thing, too, because the Greeks frequently like to show action right before it happened, not when it was happening, but right beforehand. And everybody knows this guy is about to pull his arm down and spin around and throw out that discus. And that's what we're seeing right at the beginning. But also it allows Myron to show his ability to show muscles of an ideal man in various positions. And this one, is quite sophisticated compared to what we've seen before. Notice that his head and face are still in this sort of severe style. When you think an athlete right now would probably be, showing some expression on his face. He isn't. He's calm. He's serene. And he's muscular and strong, and he's about to release this discus. And so this brings into connection two concepts I'm going to move on to now, and that or a new concept I want to talk about is the emphasis on sports in Greek life, and how that is dominates a lot of their society. And in fact, it was a gift that they gave to us, right? The Olympics, which, by the way, fell out of use during the late Roman period when Christianity hit, and only started back up in the 19th century. But we get this idea of sports and unique sporting events from the Greeks. Unique's the wrong word. I should say individual sporting events. There are some team events, but they're primarily individual events that the Greeks would celebrate. Certainly in the Olympics, they were individual games. And this is quite interesting because nobody had ever done things like this before. Had games where the individual could be the hero here, and get recognition. But it was very important, these games. If you won the games in some competition for your city, and remember it's all city states now. Athens, Olympia, Delphi, Sparta, etc. If somebody from your city won an award, they were greatly prized by the locals. In fact, people could come back, especially if you won the chariot race, we know, could come back and run for politics then. That's what great stature they had. Their physical abilities were thought to, be part of their mental abilities, and they all went together. And so I'll turn to that a little bit right now. Now, I want to point out here, this is Athens, and we're going to come back to Athens. This is with the cities that had the Olympics, had athletic games, are not like Athens, which is just a proper city-state. Here I'll show the four locations of the games: Olympia, Isthmia, Nemea, and Delphi. We'll talk about Olympia today, which is sort of a city that was built, a special city. It was just for sports. It was a holy city because of this. We'll talk about that, the same with Delphi as well. These are holy cities where when people entered, they could not fight. Right, your city-state, your politics had to be put aside. During the Olympic Games, for example, no one city-state could attack another, and if they did, they broke a very, very serious rule against the gods, etc. Now, there are four places that they rotated through. We'll talk about Olympia, the most famous and the best example of the games there. And we can see some of the games that occurred. The pentathlon was what running, jumping, discus throw, wrestling, and boxing. The pancration is a nasty boxing event where everything went except gouging at the eyes and grabbing at the genitals. And then equestrian events, the horse race and the chariot races were greatly prized, greatly prized. Olympia is located here on the western part of the Peloponnese. So it's a bit of a travel. In Athens, it would probably take a couple days to get there. But people would come from all around, and everybody would set down their arms so that everybody could travel through each other's territories and go to the games. Now here's a plan of the site, and it's separated, divided up by period. We're not going to worry too much about that, but I just want to show you that it was added to along the way. We'll focus on the purple, the orange, and the yellow for the most part. But it got added to over time. Indeed, emperors would come to the games and make gifts for them, build buildings for events to occur. I do want to point out one thing that's interesting, is this is a special city. It's just for sports. People live nearby, but basically people primarily go there for the sporting events. But also up here, and we're going to see this at Delphi too, these are treasuries. Every little city had its own sort of tiny temple, and I'll show you better examples at Delphi. And they could, quite frankly, put money in there. They'd put they'd store ingots and whatever. And since it was a holy site, you couldn't rob it. It was safe there. I mean, to rob from there got you in big trouble with the gods. So that's sort of an interesting thing, especially when it's combined with the games. We see the big track here. This is a temple here, and some later structures. These are sort of, just various rooms here with a palæstra, not a palæstra, but a gaming room in the middle, same up here, etc. Now here is the track. It is still preserved for us. There's only some seats. The ancient Greeks only had some seats that were, we can see a little bit of their remnants on the right-hand side of the track. But for the most part, people sat on the hillside. Only the special people got these seats. And I don't know if you can see way down at the end of the track, there was actually some people lined up for the run. And so that gives you an idea of just what this running distance was. And so they greatly, this is, running events were quite important to them. And here we see an example of that on the upper left. I think there's actually an image of this somewhere in the student union. And we see black figure in the top, red figure in the bottom. Red figure is a type of vest which becomes more popular in the classical period, where it's red against black, unlike the archaic, which is black against red, and not as sort of well done. The body isn't handled quite as good. But we see on the upper left, the running event. On the right, we see a pancration, a boxing event. The guys in the far left and right are judges watching on. Well, certainly the guy on the right is with a stick. Notice that the bodies are not greatly handled. The torso is just twisted around on a swivel on the legs. And these paintings are not quite as good as what we're seeing, coming soon thereafter. But nevertheless, it shows a boxing match in which the man on the right is losing. Bottom left, we see a discus thrower, nicely filling up the whole bottom of this bowl, and about to spin around and throw. In the middle, we see the chariot race with four horses rather. These are very, difficult to ride. We will, controlling four horses by just, one man takes a lot of strength. So for this chariot to be managed by this man showed he was, quite fit. And this was about the most exciting event that the Greeks considered. And we can see he's crossing some sort of crossing line that has a Doric column there to represent it. And on the far right, the javelin throw. So we're sort of familiar with all these things in our sports. Chariot races, they don't occur in the Olympics, but I know when I was a kid, there was another word for it. I can't remember. But, there were sort of races where guys, they were basically chariots, but they were called something else. And they were very light wooden sort of wagons. And they would people would race on them. Individuals would race on them, and it was a big gambling thing. I remember it's pretty much shut down in my lifetime, as far as I can tell. The javelin throw is interesting because not only did the javelin have to go far, it had to stick in at the tip. It couldn't just fall on the ground like we do now. After all, it is a weapon. It's supposed to be for killing, so it had to stick into it. But we can see once again the body splayed out in red, nice red, and covering the whole bottom of the plate as he is about to release the javelin with his left hand and throw it with his right, in a posture that we saw very similar to Artemis and Zeus. Tell you what, we're going to skip over this slide. You just saw some of these slides before. I just want to show that on this one, the Pancration on the lower left. These guys are boxing. Notice they have boxing gloves on here, but these were very, very brutal battles. And the running and the javelin throwing, etc. Go to these here. Now we see some other fun events. On the upper left, we see a black figure of a chariot race, and indeed two chariots competing against one another, and a dog running underneath. So this was a very popular design. By the way, if you won an Olympic event, you were given a vessel, a very nice vessel. That was your reward, along with the laurel wreath. Now, I want to show the other three are interesting because they're showing the long jump. It's probably best seen in the bottom two slides, and I'll explain in a moment what's going on in the upper right. We see this black figure, then later red figure, the man on the right measuring the distance, the one on the left even giving us the names of the people. Now, what's interesting about the long jump that the Greeks had is they carried weights in their hands, so that and you can see him on the upper right, this guy who has not yet jumped, but he's holding the weights in his hand in order to draw you further into the into the sand, to make your jump all the longer. So that was just a different way that they did it. We'll go through some of these we've already seen. Yes, we've seen these. We've